Have you ever been in a situation whereby you ended up saying something a bit too abruptly and offended somebody? Or have you ever felt misunderstood, overlooked, or underestimated? Communicating clearly isn't always easy, especially when there are differing opinions, reputations at stake, and emotions running high. And as paraplanners, you'll no doubt have found yourself in a situation whereby you either needed to challenge an advisor on the advice that they were giving, or else on their incomplete file. Speaking up is always something that I found difficult. I never knew how to raise a topic before it became a bigger issue. I was worried that my emotions would get the better of me. And I was the kind of person that would say everything was fine until one thing would push me over the edge, and then I would react disproportionately to the issue, giving people the impression that I was at best unpredictable and at worst slightly unhinged. And so over the years, I've learned that, you can't just run away from difficult conversations, because usually they are about important topics with people who matter. And so over the years, I've listened to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books, attended a lot of trainings on this topic. And I hope to give you some really practical, thought-provoking information to help you be more successful if you find yourself in a situation whereby you need to challenge your advisor on the advice that they're giving, manage their expectations, or else challenge them on an incomplete file. So we're going to be looking at a number of topics. So by the end of this session, I would like you to be able to recognize some of the principles that are really important when it comes to having difficult conversations. And this work draws on the work of the Harvard Negotiation Project, which I have referenced in the resource sheet that you can download if you want to explore further. We'll then look at how do we actually go about strengthening our relationships, because it's much easier to challenge someone when your relationship is already strong. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, into the actual practical, so some phrases that you can use in those certain situations. And lastly, you may be thinking, well, this is all well and good, but how do I actually develop the confidence so that I can use some of these things? So we'll be looking at that at the end. So I want to start with some key ideas that really lay the foundations for this topic. And the first is this, that effective communication isn't about what you say or write, it's about what people do afterwards. Normally, if you're raising something, it's because you're looking for some kind of behavior to change. So whether that's a process that needs changing, or some behavior that needs to change, there will be some action that you need at the end of your conversation. So otherwise, there's no point in raising it. So for some action to actually happen, the person that you're speaking to needs to actually hear what you're saying. They need to actually take on board what you're saying. And so for that to happen, what we need in place is what we call psychological safety. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but in a nutshell, psychological safety is that sense of somebody being able to really hear what they're saying without becoming defensive, without having their buttons pressed. Because when that happens, we kind of shut down and the message doesn't get through. So I'd like to ask you for a moment of reflection, to reflect on your style of communication. I work with hundreds of paraplanners, and what I've noticed is that there tends to be two camps of people. So at one end, we'll have those who are quite direct, who have no trouble in saying what needs to be said, don't beat around the bush, can get straight to the point, and yet at times can become or can be perceived as quite blunt or abrasive and can upset people. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got those who are indirect. These are kind of people who will beat around the bush. They hate conflict, they hate upsetting people. And these people really struggle with difficult conversations. And then we've got those in the middle who maybe started at one of either of these ends and have attended some trainings or really sort of rounded off those edges. So are people who can really get the job done whilst keeping their relationship strong. So just take a moment and think about where you sit on that continuum. And now I'd like you to take another moment and compare and contrast two challenging conversations that you've had. One where the um, one where the conversation went well and you kind of got the result that you were looking for, and one that didn't. Perhaps someone misunderstood what you were saying, they took offense, they took it personally, or no action happened as a result. And just perhaps pause the presentation and reflect on what do you think the factors were that led to each of those outcomes. So I'd like to move on now and look at some of these key principles that underpin effective challenging conversations. And I want to look at principles partly so that you can apply these both in your professional life, but also in your personal life too. I'm going to begin with mindset because partly because my background is psychology, and also because when the attitude that we bring to our conversation is kind of constructive, then our body language and our tone of voice, everything flows from our mindset. So there are a couple of different mindsets that people can be in when we're having a difficult conversation. The first is that people can be in a learning conversation, which is where we are looking to ask some questions and share some information. This is where we want to be in that kind of mindset where we're looking to have a conversation where we're what we call a learning conversation. The opposite of that is where we launch into a kind of battle of messages, where we have a point to prove, a finger to point, a person to blame. We think they're the problem, they think we're the problem, and we can very easily get stuck. So think about where your patterning tends to be. Are you somebody that launches into a battle of messages fairly frequently? And if so, can you shift that into, rather than a message to deliver, to a place where you've got some information to share and some questions to ask? That's what we call a learning conversation. And that's where we can have some really productive dialogue about how to move things forward. Very often when we're having a difficult conversation, we can be very fixed on what's different about us. And I want to invite you to think about, what do you both want? What's the same? What's the end goal that you're both trying to get to? Because when you can do that, you're much more easily, it's much easier for you to pull in the same direction. And that can really help when you're setting up the conversation. So you might want to say something along the lines, please, could we get together and talk about so and so, so that we, and this is where you then say something along the lines of, so that we're both clear about what's expected, or so that we can make the most of our time, or so that we can work in the most effective way. There's a lovely Irish proverb that says, a good beginning is half the work. And I think that's so true when it comes to having a difficult conversation, getting off on the right foot, or making the invitation to have a difficult conversation you need to strike the right tone so that people come to it in the right mindset. They come to it understanding where you're both trying to get to at the end of it. And lastly, the other sort of thing I observe with working with many paraplanners is that they seem to feel like they're lower down the pecking order, that the advisor they find it often quite difficult to challenge their advisor. And so I just want to remind you that you are both on the same team working for the same goal. So hopefully those things can help you get in the right mindset before you even start. So just a quick recap. Try and adopt a learning approach, a learning conversation approach. Keep in mind what you both want, and remember that you're both on the same team working for the same goal. So let's now look at some relationship strengthening strategies. So what are some of the things that we can do to keep those relationships strong? And some of you may be familiar with Stephen Covey's book called The Speed of Trust. And in it, he likens relationships to a bank account, but it's not money in the account, it's trust. And every time we come into contact with others, we've got an opportunity to either to make a deposit or make a withdrawal. And so as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be giving you tips as to what sort of can determine a deposit. Now, of course, everybody has different definitions of deposits. It might be, just doing what you say you're going to do, arriving early. There are lots of little things that you can do, but I'm going to give you some tips and some concrete things that you can take away and think about. So the first is we all tend to go at slightly different paces, and we have different priorities. So just take a moment and observe your colleague's pace and try and match it when you're having a conversation like this. Think about how they like to work and how they like to communicate. And when you can just nudge your own behavior so that it mirrors your colleagues, you're more likely to build better rapport. The next is to make sure that they feel respected. So that could manifest in lots of ways. It might be that you make a list of things that you want to talk to them about, and then you can run through it, so you're not constantly going backwards and forwards with questions. Demonstrating your respect of their expertise and their experience also go a long way. And there's a saying in this field of difficult conversations is that respect is like air. As soon as it's taken away, that's all anybody can think about. Try and avoid surprises. Excuse me. So not many people like to have something unexpected put on their desk. And this is where it's really important to be able to manage your colleagues' expectations. So the 3 golden rules for managing expectations are to do them as early as possible. So as soon as you hear an assumption or an expectation that you're not going to be able to meet, jump on it as soon as you can. The next thing is to be as specific as possible. So people will often say things like, oh yeah, we'll get that back to you between 3 and 5 working days. I would encourage you to just say 5. Buy yourself more time, because if you say 3 to 5, your colleague is going to expect 3, but you think you've got 5, and you've already got off to a sort of, mismatch. And the other thing about managing expectations is that very often we're telling someone something that they don't want to hear. And so if you can come up with a solution, if you can come up with an idea to rectify the situation or the challenge or the topic, then that's going to help to strengthen the relationship. That's going to be a deposit in that bank of trust. One of my first bosses said to me once, "Don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions." And it always stuck with me. I think it was a good training. So in the context of incomplete files, could you, for example, encourage them to use a dictaphone, so they, on their drive back from their meetings, they are speaking into their dictaphone about all the things that they picked up and heard? Could you attend the meeting? A lot of the firms that I'm working with are now encouraging their paraplanners to go to the meetings as well. That has loads of benefits, particularly when it comes to the report writing, because you were in the meeting. You don't have to have that information sort of filtered through, and of course things get lost in translation. It also means that there's another point of contact for the client at the firm. So, that's another benefit. And also, you tend to listen out for different things. And so, yeah, I would encourage you, if possible, to go to the meetings yourself if you can. Could you develop a whole load of prompts for your advisor so that they aren't just reliant on their memory? Could you get into a habit of getting the advisor to call you before they meet the client so that they can make a list of things that they need to ask? Or could you call the client? If an advisor realizes actually they forgot to ask something, maybe they don't want to make the call because they don't want to, look foolish. Perhaps you could make the call. So lots of ideas about how you might be able to make your advisor's life a little easier and you get the information that you want. Let's now move on to some actual phrases that you can use in the context of managing expectations and also challenging advisors on incomplete files or their advice. So this is where it's important to build this psychological safety. And there are two ingredients, as you can see, that go a long way to creating these conditions. The first is respect, and the second is to show that you've got their best interests at heart. And so, as I mentioned, you could use these principles in a whole different array of situations whereby you need to communicate something potentially difficult. So let's take this context first of all, where there's a lot of information in their head and it's not on the file. I'm sure many of you will recognize that situation, and if you're fairly new, then heads up, this is probably something that's coming down the line for you. So here's what you might say. You probably know the answer, although it's not in the file yet. Let's get it out of your head and in the file so that it's complete and compliant. So by saying you probably know the answer, you're giving them the benefit of the doubt, you're demonstrating, you're on their side. Let's get it out of your head and in the file so that, those two magic words, so that, in the communication courses that I run for paraplanners, these are the two magic words that I encourage them all to use, because what they do is that whatever follows them lands what you're talking about in the listener's reality. It helps them buy into what you're saying. So of course the advisors want their reports to be complete and compliant. You might say, I'm afraid I can't move any further forward with the case unless, without this information. So they can see the impact of you not having that information. Everything grinds to a halt. Sometimes advisors might be saying, why do you need that information? Why do you need such detail? And this is where you can say, if you ever needed to defend a complaint and you can't because the case isn't complete, how annoyed would you be when you know that this advice is right for the client? So that can be a useful tack to take if they're questioning why you need all that information. Let's now take a look at when you want to challenge their advice. So generally, this kind of approach that I would take would be to ask a question, and then you're sort of challenging them, but in a kind of indirect, polite, respectful way. So it might sound like, can I bring another idea into the mix? Is there another way of looking at this? Is there another angle here? What if we looked at it this way? Can I play devil's advocate here? Do you mind if I challenge this point? I think I've got a different perspective on this. And sometimes it can help to play dumb, whereby you say, please, could you help me understand this? Even if you fully know what they're talking about, sometimes in explaining it to you, they may come to the realization themselves that their logic doesn't quite stack up. So that was a look at what to say, but there are some things that we want to avoid saying. And one of the words is but. In the particular context where we're looking at kind of acknowledging what someone is saying and then making our point. So for example, I accept what you're saying, but I see what you're saying, but I take your point, but. What that word but does is it really undermines what you've just said. It really negates what you've just said. And you might think that's a small issue. However, when emotions are running high, that word but can really inflame an already hot situation. So there's a better word than but, and it is and. And effectively helps the message land in the way that you want it to land in your listener's ear. So rather than negate what you've just said, the point kind of carries on. So I accept what you're saying, and yet I see what you're saying. And at the same time, I take your point, and we also need to factor in. So hopefully you can hear how they differ and how actually they will resonate more strongly with your colleague. Other words to avoid saying are "with all due respect." When I've heard people use that phrase, it's usually because they're wanting to put an alternative view across, but they just don't have another kind of bridging word. So they say "with all due respect," which usually the underlying, the inference is that they don't massively respect their view, which is what they're challenging. The word "obviously" can be a verbal tick. And yeah, if it's not obvious to the person that you're talking to, you can make them feel stupid quite quickly. And the words, I think, when you've done your calculations and you're coming up with your conclusions, you want to be definite about what you're saying. You don't want to say, "I think it's 8,300." You want to say, "It's 8,300," with conviction and confidence. So you may be thinking, it's all very well, these phrases, these principles, these approaches, but what do I do if actually I don't feel very confident to use them? How do I actually develop my self-confidence so that I can actually use these in professional situations? And I think this word confidence gets bandied around quite a lot. And it's important to realize that confidence isn't something that you're born with. It's really something that you develop. Confidence also isn't about being the loudest person or the one with the most airtime either. I think it's helpful to think about what the actual root of the word is. And con means with, and fidere means fidelity. So that's really about trusting yourself. It's about trusting your instincts. It's about trusting your place in the world. And I think that's really, really important. It's about trusting that you'll be able to handle whatever is thrown at you. I like this definition of self-confidence, which is that it's part courage, it's part competence, and it's also got a healthy dose of self-compassion mixed in, which is important when we're moving out of our comfort zone. We need a degree of courage to help us take that step. We need a degree of competence. That's the skill building, that's the experience that we're amassing. But when it doesn't go right, we need the self-compassion to help us try again. If we beat ourselves up too harshly, then we're less likely to step out of our comfort zone and have another go. And then we just stay in our very small, comfortable comfort zone. And yeah, we don't develop much self-confidence. So I've developed these 6 steps, really kind of a roadmap as to how you would develop your confidence if it's something that you feel like you're lacking. If it's something that you're not lacking, so if you were one of those people who were right in the middle of that continuum, it maybe you could apply these 6 steps to other areas of life where you're not feeling so confident. So the first is really to trust your instincts. This is really about learning to quieten your mind. It's about looking inwards for a guide rather than outward for a map. And that can be difficult in a busy day with lots of distractions, but really it's a practice. So it's about turning inwards and quietening your mind and listening to your instinct. I'm sure we've probably all been in a situation whereby we avoided our intuition and ended up making a bad mistake or made a bad call. So listen to that small, quiet voice. The next is really to be guided by your values. So this is about recognizing what's important to you and then acting on it. And I really love this quote from Rosa Parks, who said, in she said here, I've learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with the fear. So she said that day when she refused to move off her seat on that bus because she was a Black woman, it wasn't that she was particularly courageous in that moment. It was just she was absolutely clear that that was not a just situation. It was that absolute clarity of knowing what must be done that helped her stay put. So when we're clear on what our values are, and then we act in accordance with them, that gives us that courage, that gives us that clarity, and that energy to act in a way that we feel is important. The third is about developing new skills. So of course, many of you will have taken a lot of exams, you'll be technically brilliant. And that technical expertise is only going to take you so far, because it's not just about what you know, it's also about how you communicate what you know. And I want to turn your attention to the work of Vanessa Van Edwards. Her name just went out of my head. Vanessa Van Edwards, who's written a book called Cues. So cues are these tiny signals that we're sending all the time and people are picking up on all the time, which help to communicate somebody's competence and somebody's warmth. And this is what she says after doing a lot of research, is that these are the two components that help make up somebody's charisma. So it's both competence and warmth. So, for example, if you were at the more direct end of the continuum that we talked about earlier, it may be that you, in certain situations, you want to dial up your warmth. So when we send warmth cues, we might be nodding our head when someone's talking, we might tilt our head when someone's talking, or we might smile more. And these are things that help to encourage people to talk. So that's really important. When you're having a difficult conversation, it's really important that you're able to create these conditions whereby someone feels able to add to this, what we call shared pool of meaning. If everybody withholds what's important to them or the points that they want to make, you're really going to be no further forward. So smiling, nodding your head, those are the kind of things that can really dial up your warmth. If you were a lot more at the indirect end, it may be that you want to dial up your competence cues. So competence cues are along the lines of making sure that your shoulders are quite far away from your ears, so your shoulders are back. It's about taking up the space that's yours, so it's not about shrinking or crossing your hands or your body. It's about making sure that you're taking up the space that's yours. And it's also about open hand gestures. All of those things are demonstrating your competence, and also the way that you use your voice, your intonation. Again, I've referenced her book in the resource list, and I would encourage you to look at that and implement some of the suggestions based on the situation that you find yourself in, but also where your natural style could do with a little bit of tweaking. The fourth step in the roadmap is about deciding on your identity and then proving it with small wins. And this is really from the work of James Clear, who's written an absolutely fantastic book called Atomic Habits. And he basically says, and I'm sure you've probably been in this situation, you know, you want to change something, you've got really good intentions, and you go full pelt for the first couple of days, and then things peter out and you're back to square one. And he says that is because it's only true behavior change is a result of identity change. So the question that you want to ask yourself is, who do you want to become? Are you the type of person that is always going to stay quiet or always keep your head down? Or are you the kind of person that puts the client's needs first and therefore has the courage to speak up? And that's what he says is absolutely fundamental in changing your behavior. It's about I'm the type of person who, and when you do that, your behavior will follow. So yeah, he says it's actually not that difficult to change your behavior. So you decide on who you want to become, and then you prove it to yourself with small wins. So this is about taking action that is aligned with the type of person that would do that in very small wins. So is it, for example, about, I'm the type of person who would take a breath before responding. If you tend to be quite hot-headed and quite reactive, can you embody that kind of identity? Or can you, for example, are you the type of person that feels confident to challenge somebody, and that might mean that you get your voice into a meeting early? Research shows that the longer you leave to speak in a meeting, the less likely it is that you will then contribute. So yeah, could you say I'm the type of person who's confident to put my views across? I'm the type of professional who will always put the client first. And those are the kind of identities that will help you to have more difficult conversations. So of course, you can't expect whole massive behavior change overnight, but by building up those little wins, you are building up the kind of votes, as it were, for the type of person that you want to become. And I've certainly found that to be helpful, much more helpful, for example, than affirmations. For me, affirmations that might be along the lines of, I'm confident, I'm confident, I'm confident. And yet, if you don't feel very confident, for me, that just highlights the gap between where I am now and where I want to be. But if I was able to walk into a room with my shoulders back, that's a small win. That is achievable, and I can do that. And that's a vote for the kind of person that I want to become. And so in that way, you're changing your identity. These actions are votes for the kind of person you want to become. Yeah, so every action you take is a vote type of person you want to become. I love that because it feels very doable. So I think it's worth reflecting on what you're reinforcing each day. Habits, I think, make up something along the lines of 60% of our behaviors. We do so much of our day kind of unconscious. So what are you reinforcing? Are you reinforcing staying quiet in meetings, keeping your head down? And if so, why is that serving you? How is that serving you? And is it time to change? The fifth step is really about, unfortunately, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this is really about normalizing this feeling. When we're doing something new, when we're doing something that perhaps we're not very good at, it's cringy, we feel vulnerable, it's exposing, it's all of those things. And yet, there are no shortcuts to this. You have to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. That's where the growth happens. That's where the magic lies, really. And if we're really scared of feeling uncomfortable, then we're going to be less keen to go there. It's not that in a way, and it's not that getting uncomfortable becomes any better. It's just we have to expect that. We have to get used to having a lot of eyes on us. We just have to, I used to hate public speaking, and over time I've learned just to kind of throw myself into it and just take small steps and try and have the small wins, which is I'll speak for a little bit and then I'll go. Or when I used to hate going to networking events, I just set myself a goal of speaking to 3 people and then I could leave. So you just sort of set yourself these little goals, and each time if you hit them, you're gradually expanding your comfort zone, but that does entail feeling uncomfortable. And as I mentioned, the last point really is having some kindness for yourself when it doesn't go to plan. So self-compassion is really about giving yourself the same kindness that you would to your friend, to yourself. And this can be a big deal for some people who think that speaking harshly to themselves is a way to get better performance. It's a way to drive themselves. And unfortunately, research shows that really that is quite counterproductive, that actually over the long term, it means that we often then develop these perfectionist tendencies, and that prevents us from trying a lot of new things because we think we've got to be perfect at them straight away. So yeah, practice self-compassion when things don't go right. And also, when they do go right, it's about giving yourself a moment to acknowledge what you've achieved. So that's really all I wanted to cover. I hope that's been helpful in terms of giving you some principles and some phrases and some frameworks, as well as some um, a roadmap really in terms of how to develop your confidence. So just to recap, those principles that we mentioned are all about getting into the right mindset. So having a learning conversation rather than a battle of messages. And as you'll remember, a learning conversation is about coming into that conversation with, some information to share and some questions to ask. Remember, you're working on the same team, both to help the client reach their goals, and thinking about what you both want rather than what's different about you. When we are challenging conversation, when we're having a challenging conversation, it's quite important that that relationship is strong, it's quite robust before you have it. If conversations are conducted well, they're actually really important ways of strengthening conversations. If they're done less well, then they can really be quite damaging. So there can be quite a lot riding on a difficult conversation. So demonstrate your respect for their time, be organized, come up with a list of things you want to talk about, come up with solutions where possible, and practice managing expectations. They are so fundamental in developing strong relationships. I've given you some phrases so that you've actually got something practical to take away and to use. And particularly when you're challenging advice, the format really is to ask a question. Could I challenge? Could I question that point? I think I've got a different perspective on this. And then lastly, we talked about how we develop our confidence so that you've got, you feel more able to use some of these tips. So remember, trust your instincts, get clear on your values, and then act on those. Develop your skills in terms of those cues that we talked about. Is it competence that you need to dial up, or is it warmth that you need to dial up? And that will depend on your natural style, but also the context in which you find yourself. Think about the kind of identity that you want. Who is the kind of person that you want to become? And then prove it to yourself with small wins. And remember, you're going to need to move out of your comfort zone. So try and get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And lastly, develop some compassion for yourself if it doesn't go quite to plan. So I hope that's been helpful. As I mentioned, I do run courses for paraplanners, which really help them to develop their confidence, to increase their efficiency. And if you want more detail on those, then do have a look at those links. But for now, I hope you've got some tips that will help you to rock the boat without falling out.